So, thank you very much, Georg. I think that you can all see why we are so truly delighted to have Georg Northoff applying his considerable mental powers to our field. With all due respect to the previous winners of the PFEFFER Prize, and I say that sincerely, I think that the depth of philosophical sophistication that Georg brings to neuroscience makes for a link with psychoanalysis that's really difficult to achieve properly without it. And the gap between him and, I say again with all due respect, our previous winners is mainly in this area, and it's opening up a whole new era for our field. We truly are fortunate to have your mind applied to our field, Georg. Thank you very much indeed. So we're now, as I said, Georg has been gracious enough to take some questions, even though this is the PFEFFER Award lecture. And while you're busy thinking of your questions, I'll start with two questions which I think I know the answers to. But I think I know what your answers to them will be, but it will just get us going. The first is a philosophical question. When you speak of this profound, mysterious transition between the brain and the self, and how does it happen that we don't perceive our neuronal firings or our networks and so on, but rather we perceive a subjective feeling of being in the world? You speak about it as if it's a causal transition. The one thing turns into the other thing. What is the difference between your point of view and this perspective, which is that it's not so much that one thing becomes another thing, as that it's an observational point of view. If you're looking at the brain, you see neurons. If you are the brain, you feel feelings. And it's the same thing perceived from different vantage points. Does the one thing become another thing, or is it the same thing viewed from two different perspectives? So that's my first question. The second question is a little more concrete and simple, which is, and it obviously has practical implications in relation to your two of your categories in the typology you gave us in this wonderful lecture today. It really is meant in a concrete way, a simple question. Please don't take it too intelligently. When you say that what we are, that the self in the world is always accompanied by affect, that the being of a subject is to be in an affective state, what is the difference then between affect or affective state and self? How does an affective state of being become a self? Is there a difference between the affect and the self? Bitte schön.
Dankeschön. Yeah, let me start with the easy question. Yes, I would agree that there is you can never separate the self from affect. I mean, everybody knows it. You experience, you access yourself always in an affective state. And I think this is what we really can learn, as I said, from Georg. You cannot escape affect. Affect is a very basic thing. Yeah, it's always there, it's already there. Even if you want to run away, it's always there. Yeah? So they're always together. And probably, my guess, that this distinction between self and affect is more observer-based than really plausible for the brain, or brain-based, as I would say. So the brain would probably smile. Yeah? So, but that points to a very fundamental. If there's sort of affect and object in self, there's always a certain balance, in the same way I sketch it for affect and object. And if you have a certain disbalance, so if the self is just completely emotional, yeah, it's completely overswelled. So the fact that you can have a partial dissociation between self and object, and also the opposite, that you have sort of a partial identification of it, speaks that the brain systems underlying both are not completely identical. And I probably should have not said brain system, I should have said mechanisms. Yeah? Because they probably operate across the same regions. That's what our prior studies show. We had studies on self and emotions, and they do indeed the similar regions. But we saw, and that was interesting, different directions of the correlation, the parametric correlation with the degree of neural activity in the region. So there may be some other mechanisms in the brain, of course we have no idea about them, which then sort of allow us to distinguish between the two. Because your perception, your conceptualization of both being distinguished must have some root, some necessary condition in our brain, because otherwise we would not be able to distinguish them. Yeah? So that's sort of the lesson what I take out of that. Yeah? And we are indeed working in this direction currently because we do investigate a lot the intrinsic, the resting state activity of the brain, which shows strong overlap with the self. And my guess is that that also is very closely related to what Georg Northoff said, what we call mood. Yeah? And there you have the whole thing. And how all that is related, of course, no idea. I hope that sheds some light of it. And again, you go to clinical disorders, you see the extreme disbalances, and you can learn a lot from that. You do all the lesion studies, I have all my psychiatric patients, you see the abnormalities of self and emotions in schizophrenia, yeah? The lack of affective emotions in the extreme cases of depression. Then suicide, another dimension comes into time. You're not able to, if you're not able to stretch yourself into time, into the future, if you don't feel any future, then you don't feel anything anymore. So maybe the aspect of timing maybe also underlie how affects are generated. So what I try to look what happens prior to affect. Yeah, I think that's where I go one step further than Georg, I would claim. What happens prior to that. So what makes the necessary condition of the possibility of. So, first question. This is a philosophy. So now my philosophy comes in. Okay, so you may be surprised. And it's not just for contradicting. I do not think that it is a causal mechanism. Don't understand me wrong in that. It is not a causal mechanism. Because that would mean we project our own epistemological categories, and I'm very Kantian now, upon the poor brain. Yeah? So this is what I would call a confusion between observer and brain. Yeah? So this is a very Kantian extension to the brain. Somehow unorthodox if you're a pure philosophical Kantian, but I'm not interested in that academic stuff. Yeah? So it is not a causal mechanism. And I think your view of both being distinct points, perspectives upon the same thing, in my view, are not that different. So I try, so you assume two perspectives. From the inside, you see subjective experience, mental state. From the outside, you see neural activity. And I say, Dr. Solms, it's all nice and great. Let us drink some wine, some of your good wine. Tell me, what are the necessary conditions of the possibility of that distinction between inside and outside perspective? In the literature, neuroscience of the self, always have first-person perspective. And then they have experiments comparing first and third-person perspective. To be honest, I'm not interested. Kant would have said it's purely empirical. No interest. I'm a neuroscientist, it's of no interest. Now you say the guy is completely crazy. He's not interested in the empirical. No, I'm interested in what makes this differentiation possible. Yeah? So what are the neurons? I'm looking again, I can only say I'm looking prior to what must happen in order for this first third-person perspective to be possible. So basically, I would argue, you describe the result of a process and mechanism I'm looking for. Yeah? So we can drink from the same bottle. But not exactly, because you make one assumption where I'm very critical as a Kantian. You make an ontological assumption. You say, first and third person perspective look upon the same thing. That's an ontological assumption. How can you know that it is the same thing? And trust me, I as a neuroscientist say, we principally cannot know. I'm Kantian. Yeah? We cannot know. The only way, and now I'm becoming a little bit non-Kantian, say is, we can try in the practical work, in the world, whether it works. Yeah? So only to just try and error. And that's, yeah. And I would even argue that it is, and now I'm becoming really neurotranscendental, I would even argue that by the way that our brain functions, it makes it impossible that we can know whether first and third person perspective focus upon the same thing. So this is an intrinsic character of the brain. This is the price, the epistemological price we pay. We have to pay, it's a necessary payment for our ability to experience mental states in first person perspective. So that's a real neurotranscendental slash where even a Kantian could not argue this.
Thank you very much indeed. I would point out that that price that you say we have to pay, without paying that price we can't do science. And what's interesting is that the implication of it is, of what you have just said so beautifully, which I agree with every word, is that science starts from an act of faith. At first, which is a very interesting turn up for the books. So who is going to Maggie Zalman?
Oh my goodness. So that was absolutely one of the best lectures we've ever had in this whole series. Right? So I wanted to add in something about, possible mechanisms for making that distinction between self and object. And I'm not sure if it's a question, but then I want to see where it goes. But so I'm thinking also about, in Damasio's most recent book, Self Comes to Mind, he is saying, and I'm sure many other people make that argument, is that the principal thing that the brain is for is to help the organism navigate the environment more and more adaptively. So the more complex your brain is, the more you can monitor your internal state, the more you can distinguish between what's going on in the environment and do different things so that you can survive and propagate your genes. So that being said, there intrinsically in the brain, there's a lot of contingency analysis going on, so that when my brain, there's no way I can't be philosophically correct about how I'm going to say this, so forgive me ahead of time. So there's certain circuits that are going to represent incoming stimuli. And if that's also contingent with other stimuli that has to do with what my body is currently doing, then my brain is making the distinction between me, this organism, and some other thing out there that I presume is out there. And that's one of the very fundamental mechanisms of making a distinction between self and non-self. And then as you've shown in your work and other people have, for some reason of evolution, a lot of those circuits seem to be congregating in the midline of the brain and also more towards the ventral aspect of the brain. And that when you're focusing on more external objects, you have relatively more lateral and dorsal activity. And so there's comparative processes going on in multiple parallel circuits so that the brain is continually in a process of distinguishing what's me and what's not me. And I think that one of the interesting implications for psychoanalysis and what we're working with, as speaking from being a patient, is that if I'm having an internal fantasy or an internal representation that I'm not aware of, let's say I'm preparing to give a talk and I'm imagining that the audience is going to be very critical, and then I'm having all kinds of defensive responses and anxieties, the more that I can become aware that I'm generating that fantasy and it's not a real external process, then something can change. It's like I need to bring awareness to a self-other differentiation, and that facilitates something different. So I've said a couple of loosely connected things there, but I just wanted to see what additional comment you might make about all of that.
The brain is smiling.
I don't know whether I have one. So my own brain prevents me from knowing so. So Yeah, you made some couple of very good points. Purpose of the brain, I don't know. I simply don't know. And I'm not even sure whether that question is a question. Yeah? Whether it's really a question which is relevant for the brain or just for us as a projection from the observer upon the poor brain. See, I love the brain, so this is why I always speak of the poor brain. Yeah? I don't know. Of course, I'm currently working on 2 volumes on consciousness, and we have a section, but definitely the monitoring, as is always described, yielding, this is a very cognitive view. This is, I think, we need to see what happens prior to that. And just, again, loosely connected thought, how is it, certainly the brain navigates. We have all the anticipation, what Tristan, predictive coding, all this. What Lina's pointing out, Rakel says that anticipation is an anticipation device. Yes, 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 true. But this is, again, you must be aware, what we call anticipation may be just related to us as observers, as we think it might be. But you have to take, I know it's completely paradoxical now, philosophers would kill me, you have to take the perspective of the brain. So Bennett and Hacker would say that the brain has no perspective, you're crazy. Yeah? No. You have to see what it is like for the brain. Ask that question. And then you will see maybe you ask the question, this is where I came, so I approached patients in psychiatry, not in terms of DSM-4. I hate that. And 5 I will equally hate. Yeah, because it doesn't mean anything to me. So I always try to take the perspective of the patient. What it is like for him. How does he see or she sees the world? And then suddenly all the symptoms make perfect sense. Then all the meaning stuff, and that's why I try to now get onto the mechanism and the compensatory strategies, what I tried a little bit to illustrate by the patients here. And the same thing we have to do for the brain. What it is like for the brain. Yeah? So and we have, fortunately, our brain gives us the ability to make thought experiments. That's what you can learn from philosophy. So let's do it. So I'm not sure whether this monitoring, in the way you described it, would really be a purpose of the brain from the perspective of the brain. But I don't know. And of course I have certain thoughts on it, but it would go too long. You made another very important point, and you pointed out a paradox. You said there's continuous matching going on in the brain. Internal, external stimuli. And I would extend that there's a continuous matching of internal and external stimuli with the brain's intrinsic activity, its resting state. So this is why I'm so much into rest-stimulus interaction. And when you see a recent commentary on a paper on self and tics of mine, brain relate, where I don't speak anymore of self-relatedness, but of brain-relatedness, which describes this continuous matching. So of course, the author of the main paper, Christoph, they were completely confused that I changed self-relatedness and self-specificity for brain-relatedness. Because for them it's a category. Why? Because they start with this, you see my beloved mapping strategy. Of course, from the perspective of the mapping strategy, you say brain-relatedness is crazy. Yeah? Go into psychiatry. That's why I am. Dead. Yeah? Because we have a psychiatric hospital close to our institute. So, but then you really have a continuous matching. Then you have also, if that is the case, then you have a continuous matching between brain and environment. You have an intrinsic brain-environment relationship. So that implies a certain neural coding. What the activity we see in the brain is not related to the stimulus itself, the intrinsic stimulus. It is not also the resting state activity. It's always the virtual difference between the two. This is what I call difference-based coding. But I don't want to go into detail. The neural, it's really the basic neural coding. So then you made a very nice point. We have a continuous distinction between me and non-me. But this is completely paradoxical. Before you just said there's a continuous matching in the brain. They're continuously related. So how is it possible that then on the other hand, and you described it very nicely, You have a continuous distinction between me and me. If two things are continuously related, how can they be distinguished at the same time? Yeah? So one of the more philosophical thoughts I have to that, I think that's the distinction between me and non-me, the brain would again smile about it. It is not a brain-based distinction, it's an observer-based distinction. We need that. We need these unsharp concepts in order to make some sense in the world. The brain itself doesn't need this content. It's just a continuum. My guess, it may be closely related to the degree of possible deactivation you can have in cortical midline structure. But that's a guess. Last point, very nice from your patients. I really like that. That's exactly what I would do. We have currently, so there's always, every stimulus is matched with the resting state activity of the brain. The frequency, the main power, the low frequencies, high frequencies, gamma, or very low frequency, 0.001 to 0.1. And if the frequency of the stimulus matches with the phases of the frequencies of the resting state, great. If they match well, what does the brain do? It doesn't need to induce much activity. And that's exactly what we see. There's a strong overlap between self and rest. And we have currently intracranial data from Toronto in the subcranial cingulate, where we see on the single cell level that there's that the self, the own name, doesn't induce much firing activity when compared to the previous resting state. The brain only reacts if something foreign comes. So we have to reverse our whole picture of the brain. Usually we think, oh, the self must be the strongest activity. No! The brain doesn't do that. What? This is my own name, so I'm used to this. It's great. I just continue what I'm doing anyway in my resting state. Yeah? Only when I hear suddenly strange names, never heard, then, oh, something changed. Then I need to change too. And that reverses the whole picture of the brain. And that exactly matches with your patients. I think many patients who are not able to link the incoming stimuli to their own resting state activity. Whether it's that the resting state activity itself is crazy, or whether some processes in that linkage are disturbed. For instance, in schizophrenia, you see the strong tendency that the resting state itself is so messed up that everything else afterwards happening becomes also messed up. Yeah? In depression, I would also say that depression is a resting state disorder, where you have this increased activity anterior cortical midline structure, and that confounds everything else which happens afterwards. And that explains this broad variety of different symptoms. Yeah? And that's, in psychotherapy, I would love, I hope that our results leave it, that you can have a specification of your psychodynamic mechanism, of these linkages, of brain-self, brain-object differentiation. That's what I would love to see in the future. Yeah? That you target specific mechanism of, for instance, introjection or projection. Yeah? And links them in a brain-based psychological way.
So the next question is right at the back here, Henry Nunberg.
Somewhat incoherent question. Because I've been thinking, I'm wondering what you think about language as having something to do with linking this brain-mind function in terms of many of these things that we talk about, like what we feel as versus firing, has to do with our putting it into language in one way or another. I don't know, it's an incoherent question, but that's what the hell.
I think, obviously, you can see that in my empirical work, I don't operate on the cognitive level and hence not on the language level. Because I think everything, what we see in language is somehow decided, at least necessarily, to what happened prior. Yeah? So I'm going, you see, I constantly go back. That's all I'm doing. That's all I'm doing. I just go back. Try to look what happens prior. That's the only question I have. I'm a philosopher who happens to be in neuroscience. So this is what it is. This is what we get. But the question is, in that part, I think very important that when we consider language, I could imagine that it really makes the transition from a brain-based concept to an observer-based concept. Because that's where language comes in. And our concepts are always unsharp. I mean, ask the psychiatric patients, they are not able to put their experience in concepts. It's pre-work, it's pre-reflective, as the phenomenologists say. But on the other hand, concepts are very useful. I don't need to say that, otherwise I couldn't convey my ideas to you. Yeah? And so, in that sense, and I could imagine this would be an interesting project of research to see how much concept provides a bridge between brain, the level of the brain itself, and the observer. Yeah? That's definitely, I would say so. And of course, when I do psychotherapy with patients, of course I listen to what they say, but I really listen to how they say it. And I'm sure that everybody of you does that. Yeah? You're not so much interested in what they say, you're much more interested in how they say what. Yeah? And that gives you the secret, that gives you the access to these early processes, psychodynamic processes, where meaning is generated, where you're basically in the cooking pot. You're in the cooking pot itself. Yeah?
You're still at the back, Kevin.
Yes. Well, first I have a comment and a question. Your linkage of affect and what you said about concept, I find listening to speakers, it's very, I'm as interested in how they say it as what they say. And I found it like wonderfully energizing. Every concept you introduced before, your affect was kind of right there. I mean, the way that you were engaged with what you said, and you were so excited, it was very exciting to see how enthusiastic you were about everything you were going to say. It's like, I felt if I didn't listen to the concept, I'd miss something very important because you were so excited by it. So it was really, in addition to, informative and the content of it, it was just a wonderfully energizing performance. When you said you were a performance artist before, I thought, I've never seen a neuroscientist that was a performance, but you gave really a wonderful performance in addition to the lecture. It was really very exciting and unusual, and I thought it was a very good psychodynamic representation of what you were talking about with the linkage of affect is always there. It was always there with you. Everything you said, I felt had a strong idea of how you felt about whether I agreed with it or not. I tended to agree with it. I felt clearly, I kind of understood how you felt about it, and it was very unusual. So I thought it was a wonderful demonstration that way. Then I'm going to go back to college, my college Kant, and I was very interested in what you said about Kant. As I remember, the a priori concepts of, let's say, categories of thought that were predisposed, time and space, particularly space. You cannot not see space. You can't get it from experience, from Hume. It's built into the brain. You can't not have a sense of time with experience. It's built into the brain, according to Kant. Then when Kant tried to say what's the relationship to the object, what's out there, to this intrinsic knowledge categories built into the brain, Kant said, I think it's unknowable. I thought you were saying it's knowable. I was going to ask you the relationship of the predisposition neuronal of the brain to the Kantian thing, and it's what he would call the thing in itself, what the brain is perceiving, in other words. The starting conditions, like they talk in, for example, modern cosmology, what are the starting conditions of the predisposition of this neuronal content? I was just going to ask you, and I thought you answered it, but then I got confused. Are you saying the relationship of the predisposition in the brain to the object that the brain is perceiving is unknowable, a thing in itself, as I think Kant would say, or are you saying it's knowable?
Thank you for the first comment. I appreciate it. I also thank you for the framework which makes it possible for me to really live what I think. Yeah, so that's very nice, and you know that there are not many contexts where you can do it in this way. Your question with the thing itself was touched upon my remark to Mark Solms, because he assumed basically implicitly a thing in itself when he said first certain perspective look upon the same thing. So that must presuppose the possible access to the thing itself. And I say, no. We cannot know. So, And so but it does not mean, if we cannot say anything about the thing in itself, but you have to consider, the thing itself means the things as they are independent of our cognition, observation, and knowledge. And that also means the thing itself, if you want to extend it, they definitely hold in this world, and maybe also in other worlds, necessarily so. The fact that we cannot say anything about the thing in itself does not mean that we cannot say anything about the brain. So this is very important. Yeah. I think we can say something about the empirical brain as we observe it. And I think we can also, using Kant, learn a little bit what kind of necessary conditions there must be. And then, now I'm going beyond Kant, we can conduct some experimental designs and see whether the data are in accordance with these presumed necessary conditions. So we do something what our brain does. We compare and match. This is why I'm doing this concept-fact iterativity this week. This is really sort of a neurotranscendental methodology, if you want to say so. Yeah. And so basically we do exactly the same with our brains. We match and compare. But we can never be sure whether what we match themselves, independent of the match, we can never be completely sure. That's a price we have to pay for our orientation within the world, for our intrinsic relatedness to the world. That's where all my phenomenological background comes in. Yeah? So you said a very nice thing about space and time. I'm currently working on a sequel to this mystery novel, and the publisher, Random House Germany, did not allow me to bring any fiction. So you see how frustrated I am that I make it public. So they muted that fiction part, and because they wanted a pure, very German tradition, a non-fiction book without any story and fiction. This is a German background. It would not happen in the Anglo-American. So now now I'm currently working on this book about Kant and the brain, trying to bring, for the lay audience, trying to take his biography as sort of my template. And indeed, I agree that Kant said that there's always a certain form, and these forms are time and space. And when you go further into philosophy, you see by Edmund Husserl, phenomenologists, a very elaborated concept of phenomenal time. Yeah? You have a continuous, as William James said, a stream of time, and you have always access to the past, also called retention. You have the present, and you have also a grip on the future, protension. That's what on the cognitive level is later described as anticipation. Yeah? And that means there's a certain structure of time. Yeah? And Kant would have called it form, I call it structure. The same also for space. You all sit in distinct spaces for me, but still it's one space. In objective physical space, you all occupy different space points. But still I perceive it as one homogeneous space. There's some distinction within this homogeneous space. But where the hell is this homogeneous space coming from? Not from God. That we said in the medieval age. No. Kant said it's a form in the mind. And I say it's a structure which is generated by the brain in relation to the environment. So I would argue, and this is something that I'm currently working on theoretically and then also try to put it experimentally, that the brain creates a virtual space in conjunction with the environment. So it's not a brain space. It's not a brain time. It's environment, brain, space and time. It's a spatial structure. And this, experimentally, you can maybe able to see that in your resting state activity, in your low and high frequencies relations, in your functional connectivity. So what we're currently trying to do is the frequencies, the statistical frequencies of the stimuli in the environment, how much that is reflected in the brain's resting state activity, time and space, and how we then experience those subjectively. Yeah? So, and that's what I say. The structure of the brain, environment brain structure, and I think the only dimension the brain can work with. The brain has not much features to work with, but there are two features. And it's no coincidence that Kant puts it at the beginning of his critique of pure reason, the aesthetics, the transcendental aesthetics of time and space. It's often neglected, and philosophers of course made a mess out of it, and he has no consistent view of time and space, and I think it's a very phenomenological view of time and space here. Meaning a very subjective. And Kant, the only thing Kant was interested in was in how to make sense of subjectivity. Basic sense. And this is where it comes, through time and space. And when I talk about structure, the only dimensions the brain can work with is time and space. So I go very back to the basics, look what happens with spatial and temporal dimensions of the brain. And then you see, and I hope that those also structure our subjective experience, our consciousness. And I'm not talking about the awareness of time. I'm talking about the structure, the cognition, and the perception of time. These are all secondary, tertiary processes often described by current neuroscience. No, I'm talking about the constitution of subjective time and space. What Husserl wanted to get at in his phenomenology of consciousness. I say I go one step again, prior to Husserl, what happens in the brain in relation to the environment. That's my time and space. Thank you.
I can't help, since I hold the microphone, I can't help making quickly a little comment. Freud said that he disagrees with Kant that the categories of time and space are necessary to all mentation. He made the point that this applies only in the ego, in das Ich. And in the id, there is no time and space. And in that level of the mind, there is no time and space. That the ego, in fact, imposes upon the id the categories of time and space. And I think that this goes to the question that I asked you of what is the difference between affect and subject, is that the transformation of affect into ego is the transformation of affect into representational time and space.
That's very good. Let me just briefly comment. Unfortunately, I don't know the details of that. But of course, I agree. The ego imposes it upon the rest of the part. But that's now what current neuroscience does. And this is a surprise. That the resting state, the intrinsic activity of the brain, independent of any external stimuli, is particularly sensitive to self-stimuli. There's a strong overlap between the self-networks and the rest network. And not only an overlap, there's this particular sensitivity. We showed, for instance, in a study in 2008, that the resting state is much stronger, the subsequent resting state, following the stimuli, is much stronger modulated by high self-stimuli than low self-stimuli. So, and that was not an emotional effect. So that means there must be some features in your resting state which are particularly sensitive to yourself, to your self. There must be something encoded. So, take that observation. Take the second observation, that the resting state itself generates a certain spatial and temporal structure. Low frequency, high frequency domains, gamma, and so on and so on. Spatial functional connectivity. So take those two together and you would argue that the self itself intrinsically spatial and temporal. It's at the underlying basis of consciousness. And that's what you see, for instance, in mind wandering. When I worked on my book now for the Kant book, I became aware that maybe Kant's I think has to accompany all my representations as a necessary condition of those representations to become conscious. In a way, he's right. Because what do you do in the resting state? You continuously think. And it's yourself somehow that thinks. Yeah? It has not, in Kant's language, it is not a particular object. So, and that in turn, if that is the case, then I would even argue it. I would agree. Freud was right. The ego imposes space and time. But it's not an ego which is yet experienced as such. As Kant would say, it's not an empirical self or an empirical perception. It's pure ego, it's a contentless self, ego, I, which is basically the limits of our understanding and access of epistemology.
Yes, well, and actually, Freud did include unconscious aspects in the ego. That's just a comment. Anyway, what I want you to elaborate on is something that has been driving me crazy forever and ever, is when neuroscientists use the terms neural correlates, neural underpinnings, neural representations, and I always find it insane because it exposes a Cartesian gap rather than closing anything. So I just want you to, you went by so quickly, I just want you to elaborate on the theoretical model that you are proposing that makes those terms impossible.
Okay. Okay, so, let me just, you made a brief remark to the unconscious. What I'm really interested in is, and this is important, I mean, the neurocorrelates are basically interested in the distinction between unconscious and consciousness. And then they are only interested in the sufficient conditions and leave out the necessary conditions of that. Yeah? So that's neurocorrelate. And that's basically a mapping strategy. That's a methodological strategy. Okay, I have a conscious content, and then I try to map it one-to-one onto the brain. That is basically behind. Christoph Koch is very strong. And you see the response from Christoph Koch to certain resting state hypotheses on consciousness. He's arguing exactly that. So Kant would smile and say, the current Christoph Koch is the David Hume of his time. So just focusing on empirical contents and objects, as Kant called it, but not on the necessary conditions of that objects are constituted out of stimuli. And that's where the a priori, the forms, space, and time come. And that's exactly where I'm targeting. So what Kant calls necessary condition of the possibility of, transcendental, a priori, I just put them together now for the sake of simplicity, I call neural predisposition, as distinguished from neural correlates. So I describe as the necessary conditions of the possibility of one thing. Second thing, what I'm targeting with those are not the processes which the necessary conditions for the transformation of conscious from conscious state. No, I have my narcissistic fantasies of grandeur. And I tap into what makes a non-conscious state, as Searle calls it, into a conscious state. Principal concept. Conscious describes Searle describes a principal conscious which subsumes the unconscious, the preconscious, unconscious, and distinguishes it from non-conscious. And that's what you call in philosophy the explanatory gap problem, what Chalmers calls the heart problem. So when I talk about neural predisposition, I tap exactly into the necessary condition of the possibility of a principally non-conscious state into a principally conscious state, which then is further differentiated into unconscious, preconscious, conscious. Yeah? So this is exactly the way. Of course, experimentally, I have to go through the other side, but always having in view this one. I hope that makes it. And last slant on all this neural correlate stuff, I'm equally angry about this. All this representation stuff. I mean, it's a wrong reading of Kant because his concept of representation was used in a completely different context. Yeah, I mean, and they don't get away with all this representation stuff. Thomas Metzinger, in his book, Being No One, he sometimes gets it. It's very interesting. He is a brilliant phenomenologist, but all this representation and cognitive stuff, and then he said, there are some certain processes unavailable. He speaks of attentional unavailable. Yeah, these are the processes which are of interest. This is what I'm targeting. Yeah? Everything else is just mask.
So, one last question from this intense-looking chap.
One of the interdisciplinary bridges you didn't so much mention, or you mentioned in passing, is the bridge between evolution and psychoanalysis. And I was wondering how you might position your work in relation to people like, Randolph Ness, who argue that psychodynamic concepts. Whoa. People like Randolph Ness, evolutionary psychologists, who argue that psychodynamic concepts are a crucial starting point for understanding the evolution of the mind, for understanding evolutionary psychology. So I was just wondering how you would situate your work. And then it just as a, I don't know if this is connected or not, but one of the things that you mentioned earlier is that you said, I don't know what the purpose of the brain is. And I just wondered, maybe I'm reading too much into that, I wondered if that was somehow distancing yourself from this evolutionary tradition, which would say clearly the purpose of the brain is to help to adapt the organism and so on to the conditions of its life.
I mean, that statement was a very honest statement. I simply don't know, and I must admit, the question of evolution, I mean, you see where I'm coming from. The question of evolution is too big of a question for me at this point. I'm not versed enough in that field to really make a comment. I mean, my encounter with, of course, I'm a product of evolution, but by myself, but my encounter with evolution was really more through Georg Northoff, who says this is a basic emotional system of evolution ingrained, and that sort of made me thinking a little bit into this. And of course, I would assume that the same mechanism I investigate, I try to target when I mean neural predisposition, that I would assume them also to be present in other species. Yeah? The coding scheme, for instance, and these kinds of things. But maybe in a less elaborated way. And I have actually one doctoral student from France who wants to work on these things. But in the present moment, I must admit, I'm simply not versed enough to make any statement in that regard. And the statement that I don't know the purpose of the brain is a very honest statement. I don't know. The only thing I feel, only sense that this cognitive stuff and this orientation, there is something lacking. The essential thing is lacking. I don't know what, but something is really lacking. Yeah? What we really want to target.
So since we began with a couple of little jokes, I'll end with a joke. A psychodynamic perspective on evolutionary psychology. I don't want to be a product of evolution. I want evolution to be a product of me. So you can see Georg has led us to, or is leading us to, a source of the Nile. And I think that it reminds us also of the profundity of the questions that we're dealing with in our field and the beautiful clarification that you brought to it today. I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say we are truly grateful for that. Remember to come on the 3rd of November and separate yourself from your money at the Red Rooster restaurant. And then the Saturday after that we have, who's our speaker? Maggie hasn't decided yet. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Professor Dr. Doctor.